Okay, this is Philosophy of the Arts, an Introduction to Aesthetics, 3rd edition by Gordon Graham in the Routledge Press. Introduction. The arts are an important part of human life and culture. They attract a large measure of attention and support from states, commercial companies, and the public at large. But what makes something art, and why should we value it? These are practical questions for civil servants, charitable trusts, private sponsors, and educational establishments. They are also theoretical questions with which philosophers have been concerned for more than 2,000 years. Over that long period, a number of important answers have been developed and explored. And the purpose of this book is to introduce newcomers to the field of aesthetics and art theory, to both the problems and their resolution. Philosophy of art is simply an attempt to answer these questions in a sustained and coherent way, while drawing upon the thinking of the major philosophers who have devoted most attention to them. My intention, however, is not just to provide a textbook for students of philosophy. The book also aims to demonstrate to anyone who reads it, student or non-student, that philosophy of art or aesthetics is directly relevant to the study, appreciation, and practice of the arts. Philosophers are not the only people to develop theories of art. Sociologists, musicologists, art critics, and literary theorists have done so as well. But what philosophy has to say on these topics is especially relevant to any serious thinking about the value and importance of art. At the same time, it becomes lifelessly abstract if it is too far removed from the arts themselves. That is why, after 4 chapters on general themes, the book divides into chapters expressly devoted to particular art forms, including, for the first time in this edition, the performing arts. The idea is to stimulate an interest in philosophy among those whose principal motivation for approaching these topics is a love of music, painting, film, literature, drama, dance, or architecture. Chapter 10 considers at length some recent developments, especially in the plastic arts, and addresses a common concern about modern art. Is it art at all? While Chapter 11 investigates the topical subject of environmental aesthetics. The final chapter of the book explores more complex issues of art theory and, in particular, the Marxist, structuralist, and postmodern approaches to art. One special difficulty about focusing on the specific rather than the general is this: we can only talk meaningfully about paintings, poems, symphonies, and so on if, quite literally, we know what we are talking about. This means that the reader needs to be familiar with the illustrative examples, and it is impossible to be sure of this in advance. So far as I can, I have used the very best known examples of artworks. For example, the Mona Lisa, Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, Charles Dickens' Bleak House, etc. But sometimes less well-known examples illustrate the point at issue better. Happily, this difficulty is much less great than it was with the first edition because of the internet, which has become a hugely valuable resource for this purpose. In addition to a complete bibliography, there is a list of websites where collections of artworks, including music, will be found. Suggestions for further reading have also been reorganized for this edition. At the end of each chapter, I have identified more advanced introductory reading, classic writings, and major contemporary studies. With one or two exceptions, the advanced introductory reading is taken from two books that have appeared since the first edition was published: the Routlege Companion to Aesthetics, now in its second edition, and the Oxford Handbook of Aesthetics, both of which are accessible, comprehensive, and authoritative. So far as is possible, I have identified classic writings from the past, but in a few cases included more recent works. All of them have been the focus of widespread discussion. The third category aims to draw attention to major and important contemporary works, though inevitably this is a tiny selection out of all the available choices. The bibliography at the end includes full details of all these publications, together with works cited in the text. In addition, it lists other books and articles that will be of interest to readers, following up the topics of the different chapters. There are a good many introductions to the philosophy of art, and several more since the first edition of this one. The distinctive feature of mine is its focus on the value of art and the exploration of normative issues in the context of specific art forms, as well as the aesthetic appreciation of nature. This approach rests upon an assumption that is better for the philosopher of art to investigate the question of art's value than to try to arrive at a definition of art. An assumption defended at length in the final chapter. I have put this defense at the end of the book because, though it is logically prior and philosophically crucial to the cogency of my approach, a reader whose interest is primarily in matters artistic can usually read the book up to that point without going on to engage directly with the rather more abstract philosophical issues involved in defending a normative approach. The third edition covers several topics that the first and second did not. Despite these additions, however, some interesting questions in aesthetics have inevitably been omitted. This is unavoidable because typically philosophy raises more questions than it answers. The point of an introduction is not to provide a definitive set of solutions to a designated set of problems, but to start the mind of the reader on an exploratory journey of its own. Chapter 1, Art and Pleasure. The most familiar question in philosophical aesthetics is this: what is art? Why is this question worth asking? The answer has to be that art matters. The question, what is art, is really the question, what counts as art? And we want an answer to it in order to know whether or not something should be accorded the status of art. In other words, a concern with what is art is not just a matter of classification, but a matter of cultural esteem. There are then two fundamental issues in aesthetics: the essential nature of art and its social importance or lack of it. Philosophical aesthetics has tended to focus on the first of these questions, almost exclusively, in fact. But there is a lot to be said for tackling the second question first. Accordingly, over the course of the next few chapters, we will examine 4 attempts to formulate a normative theory of art, which is to say, one that will explain its value. What makes art valuable? A spontaneous answer, even to the point of being commonplace, is this: art is a source of pleasure or enjoyment. For the sake of a label, we could call this view aesthetic hedonism, from hedos, the Greek word for pleasure. The purpose of this chapter is to investigate the adequacy of aesthetic hedonism as a normative theory of art. Hume on taste and tragedy. Some philosophers have thought that the value of art is necessarily connected with pleasure or enjoyment because, they argue, to say that a painting, a poem, a play, or a piece of music is good is just the same as saying that it pleases us. The best known philosopher to hold this view was the 18th century Scottish philosopher David Hume, 1711 to 1776. In a famous essay entitled "Of the Standard of Taste," Hume argues that the important thing about art is its agreeableness. The pleasure we derive from it, and that this is a matter of our sentiments, not its intrinsic nature. Judgments about good or bad in art, according to Hume, are not really judgments at all, because sentiment has a reference to nothing beyond itself and is always real wherever a man is conscious of it. Hume, 1963-38. In other words, if I like a thing, I like it, irrespective of any characteristics it possesses. To seek the real beauty or the real deformity is as fruitless as inquiry as to seek the real sweet or real bitter. That is to say, aesthetic preferences are expressions of the taste of the observer, not statements about the object. And Hume thinks the wide diversity of opinions about art that we find in the world is confirmation of this fact. Here we touch upon a question that many people think is central to the philosophy of art. Can there be objective judgments of aesthetic value? Hume's essay is widely taken to be the classic exposition and defense of view that they cannot be. That aesthetic opinions are essentially subjective. However, the main discussion of this issue will be postponed to a later stage, chapter 10, because for the moment we are concerned not with the suggestion that aesthetic appraisals are subjective, but with the idea that by their very nature they are connected with pleasure. As a defense of subjectivism in aesthetics, though, Hume's essay is not really very persuasive. While he observes that aesthetic opinions can differ greatly, he also recognizes that at least some artistic sentiments can be so wide of the mark as to be discountable. If aesthetic appraisal is a matter of feeling, it seems there can be aberrant feelings. The case he considers is that of a minor writer being compared with John Milton, the great poetic genius who wrote Paradise Lost. Though, says Hume, there may be found persons who give the preference to the former, no one pays attention to such a taste, and we pronounce without scruple the sentiment of these pretended critics to be absurd and ridiculous. What this implies is that even though taste is a matter of feeling things to be agreeable or disagreeable, there is still a standard of taste, and the question is how these two ideas can be made consistent. Hume's answer is that the standard of taste arises from the nature of human beings, since they share a common nature. Broadly speaking, they like the same things. When it comes to art, he thinks some particular forms or qualities from the original structure of the internal fabric of the human mind are calculated to please and others to displease. There are, of course, strange reactions and opinions. People can prefer the oddest things. But Hume believes that the test of time will eventually tell, and that only those things which truly are aesthetically pleasing will go on calling forth approbation as the years pass. On the face of it, Hume's theory seems to fit the facts. Artistic tastes do not differ greatly, yet broadly speaking, most people like and admire the same great masterpieces in music, painting, literature, or architecture. Still, contrary to Hume's suggestion, this shared tendency on the part of the majority of people merely reveals a common taste. It does not validate any standard of taste. The fact that a feeling is shared by many people does not make it rationally obligatory for everyone to feel the same. If an individual has extremely peculiar musical tastes, say, we can certainly regard them as odd, but if Hume is right in thinking that aesthetics is all a matter of feeling, we have no good reason to call them absurd and ridiculous. They are merely different. If we want to say that some views about art are mistaken, we cannot make the mistake rest on human feeling about art. It just is what it is, but on something about the art itself. For present purposes, however, Hume's contention about feeling as the basis of aesthetic judgment is not the main issue, which is rather the connection he alleges between aesthetics and pleasure. Suppose it is true that people declare artworks and performances to be good or bad in accordance with the feeling those works prompt in them. It does not follow that the feeling has to be one of pleasure. Hume, along with most of his contemporaries, believed that only pleasure could explain the power of art to attract and hold us. This is why, in another famous essay entitled Of Tragedy, he finds it's puzzling that people should willingly watch plays, read poems, and view paintings that include events which would normally horrify them. His explanation of this phenomenon is that though the horribleness of the events would naturally repel us, it is overlaid with, or even turned into, pleasure by the artistry with which the events are depicted. This extraordinary effect proceeds from that very eloquence with which the melancholy scene is depicted, the genius required to paint objects in a lively manner, the art employed in collecting all the pathetic circumstances, the judgment displayed in disposing them, the exercise, I say, together with the force of expression and beauty of oratorial numbers, diffuse the highest satisfaction on the audience and excite the most delightful moments. By this means, the uneasiness of the melancholy passions is not only overpowered and effaced by something stronger of an opposite kind, but the whole impulse of those passions is converted into pleasure. Hume, 1963, 224. But why is it puzzling that people are attracted by tragedy? The problem arises only because Hume assumes that people must be deriving pleasure from the depiction of horrible events. Perhaps, on the contrary, some people relish unpleasant feelings. If so, then Hume is right to think that their aesthetic appraisals reflect sentiment or feeling, but wrong to think that the feeling in question is one of pleasure. It follows that the connection between art and pleasure is not a necessary one. To say that a work of art is good or valuable on the strength of the feelings it invokes in us is not the same as saying that we find it enjoyable. Moreover, we might describe it in positive terms, gripping or compelling, for instance, without implying that we derive pleasure from it. The loathsome can exercise a powerful fascination. Nevertheless, though good does not mean pleasurable, it still makes sense to claim that art is to be valued chiefly because of the pleasure or enjoyment it gives. It is this, I think, rather than Hume's thesis, that most people who believe there is a connection between art and enjoyment mean to assert. Collingwood on art as amusement? Is it true that art is principally valuable as a source of pleasure and enjoyment? It is worth noting that it is not always natural to speak of enjoying art. People quite easily say this of novels, plays, films, and pieces of music, but less easily of paintings, sculptures, and buildings. So, even if it were agreed that enjoyment often explains the value of art, some further explanation of just what this might mean in the case of the plastic arts and architecture would be needed. But a more important difficulty is this: to say that art is something we enjoy tells us next to nothing. People enjoy lots of things: their work, their holidays, their food. When someone says he enjoys his work, we usually ask what it is about the work that is enjoyable and expect his answer to tell us about what he finds of value in it. Enjoyment does no more than signal that he values it. In a similar fashion, the initial claim that art is a source of enjoyment is not in itself informative. It simply leads on to the next question: what makes it enjoyable? It is often assumed, as Hume assumes, that the answer is obvious. Things are enjoyable because they give us pleasure. Now, the concept of pleasure also needs some clarification, because it can be used in such a general fashion that it means little more than enjoyment in the sense just described, in which case we are no further forward. But getting clear about the concept of pleasure is not as easy as we might suppose. There is a tendency to conflate pleasure with happiness, as though they were synonymous, when they are not, and another tendency to think of pleasure as the psychological opposite of pain. Both these tendencies are to be found in the founders of philosophical utilitarianism: Jeremy Bentham, 1748 to 1832, and John Stuart Mill, 1806 to 1873. And since utilitarian ideas have had such a powerful influence on contemporary culture, these tendencies have become widespread. The sense of pleasure we want to examine here is something like entertainment value. The value of art is that it offers us entertainment. This is a thesis that the British philosopher R.G. Collingwood, 1889 to 1943, discusses in The Principles of Art. One of the major works of aesthetics published in the 20th century, and one to which we will have occasion to return in a later chapter. Collingwood calls the belief that the value of art lies in its ability to entertain us. Art as amusement. While he is partly engaged in the traditional task of philosophical aesthetics, namely defining what art is, his interest is a normative one. The purpose of this book is to arrive at a satisfactory conception of art proper, or true art, as we might say. And what he wants to show is that art as amusement falls short of art proper, confusing the two hides an important mistake. Collingwood does not mean to deny that there are people for whom the arts are a form of entertainment, and it may indeed be the case that, as a matter of fact, they genuinely find amusement in plays, novels, and so on. This is an important point to stress. To claim that art as amusement falls short of art proper does not require us to deny that the arts have recreational value and can entertain us. Collingwood's contention is that if this is all we find there, we have missed the thing most worthy finding. His analysis of the error in art as amusement is both insightful and persuasive, but best considered in connection with his own positive theory of art, which will be examined in Chapter 3. At this point in the argument, it is sufficient to register a doubt he raises about an important assumption at work. The thesis that art is valuable for the pleasure or amusement we derive from it depends, crucially, on the truth of the factual claim that we do indeed derive pleasure from it. Screws fall out all the time. Okay, I think there it is. Is this actually true? What is at issue here is not a matter of language or belief, but a matter of experience. First, people readily use the language of pleasure and enjoyment in connection with the arts. But it does not follow that the thing they experience is properly called pleasure. Second, for all sorts of reasons, people will claim that they enjoy major novels, great masters, the music of the concert hall, and may make this claim quite sincerely. But what they choose to do is often a more convincing test of their real opinion than what they feel constrained to say. Once we shift our attention to the choices they make, it is not at all obvious that most people find most of what we call art pleasurable in any straightforward sense. Someone who wants to read simply for pleasure is far more likely to choose a novel by John Grisham than by William Faulkner, though the label literature would be attached to the latter rather than the former. Romantic comedy is a more obvious choice than art film for most people going to the cinema just for pleasure. Channel hoppers wanting an evening's entertainment at home are, by and large, more likely to stop at a soap opera than Shakespeare, and who, apart from a very few, would prefer the art gallery to the restaurant if what is in view is simply pleasure. Such preferences need not prevail universally for the general point to hold. Such preferences need not prevail universally for the general point to hold. Great novels can also be diverting and amusing. But there is this further point to be emphasized. People who, for the purposes of entertainment, choose soap opera over Shakespeare or Grisham over Faulkner are most unlikely to claim that what they have chosen is artistically more valuable or significant. Probably they will agree that Faulkner is a far more important writer than Grisham. Even so, his novels provide a much less pleasurable way of passing the time. In the same way, easy listening is preferable to Beethoven's late quartets because it is easy, not because it is greater art. The fact that personal pleasure and artistic significance can be divorced in this way lends support to Collingwood's contention that the prevalence of art as amusement, as the explanation of aesthetic value, has distorted people's ability to ask honestly just how much pleasure they derive from high art. Collingwood thinks that there is often a measure of self-deception in people's attitudes, because there is often a conventional pressure to claim to enjoy art. But if we are honest, most of us will admit that the entertainment value of high art is quite low compared to other amusements. The masses of cinema goers and magazine readers cannot be elevated by offering them the aristocratic amusements of a past age. This is called bringing art to the people, but that is a claptrap. What is brought is still amusement, very cleverly designed by a Shakespeare or a Purcell to please an Elizabethan or a Restoration audience. But now, for all its genius, far less amusing than Mickey Mouse or jazz, except to people laboriously trained to enjoy it. Collingwood, 1938, 103. Collingwood's judgment on his contemporary culture may sound harsh, but he draws our attention to a point of some substance. Forms of entertainment have become more sophisticated over the centuries. What would have amused the yokels in the pit at Shakespeare's Globe Theatre must seem a very poor form of entertainment to a generation reared on television programs like Fawlty Towers, Friends, and Blackadder. These are far funnier than the comic scenes in Twelfth Night or A Midsummer Night's Dream. And it is only a dogmatic commitment to the belief that great art gives great pleasure that could lead us to deny it. In any case, there is this further objection. Even if we were to agree, contrary to what has been said, that art can be relied upon to amuse, this would not give us any special reason to value or pursue it. There are many other cheaper and less taxing forms of amusement. Card games, picnics, crossword puzzles, computer games, for example. If simple pleasure is what is at issue, on the surface at any rate, art is at best only a contender for value, and in all probability, a rather weak one. Mill on higher and lower pleasures. The argument of the preceding section called into question an alleged fact that people generally derive pleasure from art. But suppose that they do. There is still an important difficulty to be overcome. Not all works of art are to be valued to the same extent. If the value of art did not lie in the pleasure we get from it, how are we to discriminate between artworks that differ in quality? How could pleasure explain the difference between, for example, Bach's B minor Mass and Boccherini's Minuet, Tolstoy's War and Peace, and Graham Greene's Brighton Rock? Or a production by the Royal Shakespeare Company and one by the local Amateur Dramatic Association? If all of them give pleasure, why should we rank some so much higher than others? Some people feel tempted to reply that we shouldn't. We ought to respect the fact that different people enjoy different things, and not to try to elevate some personal preference over others. In fact, this appeal to equality has led critics and teachers to abandon not just the distinction between high and low art, but any notion of a canon, i.e., any list of great masters in classic works, whether in music, painting, literature, or theater. This attack on the idea of a canon is an important aspect of the avant-garde in modern art and will be discussed at length in Chapter 11. For the moment, though, it is enough to note that most people do go on distinguishing between major and minor writers, painters and composers, and between their greatest and less great works. It is common, therefore, for both artists and audiences to differentiate between the light and the serious in art. Between, for instance, farces and tragedies, Strauss waltzes and Beethoven symphonies, the poetry of Edward Lear and that of T.S. Eliot, the novels of P.G. Wodehouse and those of Jane Austen. Strauss, Lear, and Wodehouse were all highly talented, and the works they produced are all to be valued, but they lack the profundity and significance of Beethoven, Eliot, and Austen. The question is, how can such distinctions be drawn if all we have to go on is the pleasure we derive from them? This second distinction between the light and the serious in art cuts across the first. Part of the motivation for subverting any canon has been a sense that an unwarranted bourgeois elevation of the art of the gallery and the concert hall has led to a denigration of folk art. But as far as our present concerns go, folk art can sometimes be serious, when high art, by contrast, can be frivolous. Many of the folk tales and rhymes, assiduously collected by Peter and Iona Opie, for example, touch on themes far deeper than the story lines of many modern novels. It still remains to explain this difference.